Welcome to World Affairs. I'm your host, Marina Kufa, and I want to welcome a very special guest today, American businessman and politician who served in the United States House of Representatives, Dennis Ross. Thank you so much for joining us. So please tell us what sparked your interest in politics.
I wrestle over that. When I was a little kid, I've always had an interest in politics. I know that I didn't have anybody else in the family, but my parents were from different political persuasions. My mother was a lifelong Democrat, my father a lifelong Republican, and they would joke about how they'd cancel each other's vote out on election day, but they never really had any serious discussions that one of them got up and got mad and left the dinner table. And I had an interest as a kid. I wrote to the presidents back then. I wrote a letter to Richard Nixon, and his staff wrote me back. And so I just had an interest through high school, community involvement, college, practicing law. I got involved in community activities, ran for office, served in the state legislature and then Congress. So it's just been part of what I've enjoyed doing. Hopefully it's not been my livelihood, so that I can say that it's more of a passion for trying to do what I think is right for the community. I left Congress, and I left voluntarily because I was concerned that we weren't doing enough in education in terms of bringing parties together, in teaching the importance of civic engagement, that everybody has an obligation, whether it be picking up trash in your community or just taking an interest in the livelihood of others around you, because we would create a better neighborhood, a better community, a better state, a better country. But more importantly, we've got to teach people how to have civil conversations over controversial topics, that it's okay to have a different opinion. It's okay to not agree. But it's also important to understand how much we have in common. And so what we created here at the American Center for Political Leadership is research-based curriculum, research-based tests that not only be able to teach civics, civic engagement, but also to help people understand why they have the propensity to either be engaged or not engaged, and what we can do to help them. It's a great tool to help employers. It's a great tool to help universities, to help their students. We need to be able to recognize statesmanship as an honorary, as an able, as a necessary profession in order to build good leaders. The one thing that concerned me when I was in Congress was watching the Kavanaugh hearings and the character assassination of not only Kavanaugh, but also the witnesses against him. Why would anybody want themselves, their family, their grandchildren, their children involved in politics if that's what's going to happen? What leads then is a conclusion of nothing but bad people in a process that needs people in it. And that's where our country will have the greatest demise, if you will, of our freedoms. And so we've got to encourage good people to get involved, not for a career. And I made that clear. That's why I got out of Congress. I wasn't going to make a career out of it. But we've got to have people get involved in their communities, either in elected office, communities, community organizations, and education of why it's so important. Let's take these kids at an early age and say, you know what? You don't have to be an athlete. You can if you want. You don't have to be a musician. You can if you want. You don't have to be a leader, but we can show you how to be one, because we're going to need good leaders in this country. And that's what we're doing at the American Center for Political Leadership. We're helping build good leaders for this next generation.
What are your current thoughts on the current state of politics? Anything you would change?
I've seen a deterioration in civility and decorum over the last 30 years. I've seen it in just about every sector of life, but more predominantly in the political arena. And I'm very concerned about that, because we are not training each other or even desiring to have conversations over controversial topics that lead to resolution, or at least building a relationship with the other person of diverse thought. And in the political arena, this polarization is starting to create this greater emphasis on identity politics, that you're either for me or against me, and if you're for this issue, then none of the other issues matter. And I think that's wrong. And if you look at the founding of this country, you know, when they went into the Constitutional Convention in 1787, there was a great deal of diversity of thought. There was a great deal of dissension. There was a great deal of frustration. But yet they also understood that consensus, that reaching the ultimate goal of compromise was necessary in order to form a country. And that's what's the beauty of how our Constitution was developed. Today, we look at it as, you know, compromise is my way or no way, and I think that's wrong. I think that politicians would like to seek resolution, but have become somewhat conflict avoidant, and have been placing the blame elsewhere instead of just taking the lead in trying to build relationships of opposite thought, political thought, in hopes of trying to seek some sense of resolution, or at least make some headway towards the greater good. And that's what bothers me about the political world today, is that we're not focusing on that.
What do you think is the biggest misconception of politicians?
Well, one of the biggest misconceptions I think about politicians is that everybody thinks they're corrupt. And now there are those that are always bad actors. There are those that do things they absolutely shouldn't. But you know, our system of government, which is self-government, requires that we have people participate in the process. And in order to have a better society, a better generation than the one, you know, that's leading now, it's going to require that we have good people in there, people that understand the greater good, what I call statesmen, that put the greater good above their political office. And you know, we need to be building emphasis on statesman-like behavior. We need to look at how we bring these people together. I'm a little concerned that as a country we're not elevating recognition to good people to be good leaders. We're focusing a lot on celebrity status. We're focusing a lot on athletic status. We're focusing a lot, quite frankly, on STEM, which is a great thing to have, you know, in terms of education. But we're not focusing on how we build leaders. And if we want to see good leaders, we need to have programs at the kindergarten level through the 12th grade, communities recognizing people for doing good things. And so the biggest misconception in my mind about politicians is that people think that they're all corrupt. Even my students, when I teach here at Southeastern University, feel that they don't want to get involved in politics because they're corrupt and they don't want to be considered a corruptible person. That's a misconception. There are some bad apples, no question about it. But having served in Congress, most of the people that I serve with on both sides of the aisle are sincere, are well-intentioned. We just have different ways of trying to accomplish the same end goal.
I was going to ask you, you miss being in a game, but you're still in the game.
I serve on the board of the former members of Congress. I do. We go out and do what's called a Congress to College program, where we go and visit college campuses throughout the country with a person from the opposite side of the aisle. I'll go out with a former member, a Democrat, and we'll discuss the importance of being involved in the political process, the sanctity of our system of government and of Congress. I'm still involved on issues. I do some writing. I do a lot of interviews. I'm very much interested in policy still, but my focus is predominantly on process. We've got to have people involved in the process, more so than really developing policy. Because policy, quite frankly, goes nowhere unless it has the infrastructure of process by which it can be vetted, discussed, and hopefully seek resolution.
How do you think the war in Ukraine is changing the global science?
Well, it's changing in several ways. One is how Russia is no longer really a research partner with many of the countries who have now had to divest themselves from Russian alliances. You know, Russia was really big into physics. They're really big into the space program. They have strong research facilities there. Those have been strained. Many researchers, I think you're seeing a brain drain from Russia, of many researchers starting to leave Russia and go elsewhere and not seek partnerships or collaboration with Russian scientists. That's one area. The other area is that because of Russia's dominance in the energy world and in the agricultural world, you're seeing a change in how we address renewable energy sources. You know, there's a greater urgency now in Eastern and Western Europe for alternative energy sources. They're not ready for this. They weren't ready for this. They'd shut down their coal plants. They'd shut down their nuclear plants. They were, you know, Gazprom with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline getting ready to open up. They were, you know, just taking everything they could from Russia. That's changed, and as a result of that, research, global research in energy has changed significantly. Like it or not, they're going to have to find some way to survive. Also in agriculture, you know, there was Ukraine's breadbasket for Eastern Europe and Russia. We're seeing that diminish significantly because of the war, and how do you take up that slack? Where do you go? You know, you try to do research, you try to do different methods of agricultural production. That has been changed. The course of that has been changed. It's been expedited. But, you know, global research has been significantly impacted because of the Ukraine war, both in terms of research partnerships as well as the research that was being done on major issues, including climate change, including food science and agricultural production.
How do you think the countries should work together to help fight extreme poverty in the world?
Poverty it's interesting because you can't use the United States as an example. And let me tell you why. Since the war on poverty in 1964 under the Johnson administration, we've put trillions of dollars into trying to raise our level of income, our affluence, and our war on poverty has had dismal results. So I don't think it's a matter of investment as much as it is a matter of investing in education, investing in resources, in infrastructure. You know, most people, and I would say a vast majority of people, want to have a better life and are willing to take the risk to work towards a better life if given the opportunity. Creating these opportunities for people to pull themselves up and get out of poverty is one of the best things we can do. Just giving money doesn't do anything but create a greater sense of dependency, and I think we've realized that in the United States with our war on poverty. But what we need to be doing is creating partnerships, which we do have with USAID, with United Nations. There are a lot of non-governmental organizations out there that deal in poverty, that deal in hunger, but it's a matter of trying to get education, to give these people the opportunity. If they can see what's on the other side, that if they put their own effort into it and we are there to support them in their own effort, we can lift poverty up. And we've seen that happen in third world countries more significantly than we've seen it happen in the United States, where we have spent trillions of dollars in trying to get people out of poverty.
What do you think is the main cause of a world hunger?
Poverty is one of the biggest reasons for world hunger. The other thing is, cultural. I had a chance when I was in Congress to tour the country, and I was in Eastern Africa. And we spent some time in Kenya and Tanzania visiting the agricultural institutions there and what investments we had been making through the United States Department of Agriculture. And culturally, the women do most of the work. The men don't, but they also don't accept new practices, different ways to rotate the crops, different ways to kill the bugs. We also showed them that if cash crop was coffee, but it would take 6 months to a year to get the harvest off that. What do you do in the meantime? Well, they have cattle over there, and even though they don't utilize their cattle as a food source for meat, they do utilize it for milk purposes. We showed them how to create these milk exchanges where everybody would bring in the milk that day, and we would have a consortium that would create milk products. They would create butter. They would create pasteurized milk. They would create ice cream, things of that nature. And those became kind of like their bread and butter, if you will, daily subsistence. So we changed somewhat of the culture. Again, by education and by showing them that they can make a profit by doing this, which is a good incentive. Poverty is the biggest thing that affects us in terms of hunger. Education's another thing. Infrastructure, being able to have an opportunity to go elsewhere. Transportation breeds opportunity. And if you allow somebody a chance to go somewhere to make that difference, to expand on their own resources and skills, it lifts them out of poverty. It helps their nutrition, and hunger doesn't become as much of an issue as it is, but right now it's a terrible issue that we have got.
How, in your opinion, should be the competition between the U.S. and China in the Middle East?
About 7 years ago, I think it was, maybe 7, 8 years ago, China developed their Belts and Roads Initiative, which was a global policy to invest in infrastructure in several regions of the globe in order to create greater commerce, economic ties, greater trade, and things of this nature. And they've done so significantly in the Middle East. And as a result of that, they've been somewhat successful. We have our Blue Dot Network that we've tried to respond to that. But the one thing that we have, first of all, in the BRI, the Belts Roads Initiative, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of fraud. I mean, that's just fraught with that. That's China's, that's their monkey on their back they have to deal with. But one of the things it has been doing is it has been creating ports. I mean, China put a port in Haifa in Israel to the consternation of the United States. They're putting ports in Oman and other areas of the, I think, Dubai and Djibouti. So it's working, but we as a nation, United States, has one thing that is very effective, and that's our military presence, which provides us to be the guardians, if you will, of the Middle East. We should not only continue to do that, but we should also help with the relationship building, the Abraham Accords, which allowed Dubai and Bahrain and Morocco to sign agreements and cooperative agreements with Israel, have been very beneficial, not only in terms of security, but especially in terms of economic development. Israel is an economic engine. I mean, they are a true startup nation that has been the strongest economy in the Middle East, and others, Arab nations, are starting to realize that and wanting to partner with that. Plus, they also have a strong military. So we need to continue to be very competitive in the Middle East, not only because of Russia, but because also we stand to gain a great benefit in terms of a better trade balance between the United States and the Middle East.
What possible opportunities, challenges, and options are there for Middle Eastern countries?
The Middle East has gone through quite a transformation, especially since the Arab Spring, and also the continued relationship building that Israel is doing with some of its Arab partners. Iran is a scary component for not only the free world, but also other Arab nations. I mean, just across the Persian Gulf, you've got Qatar, you've got the Arab Gulf states there that are very concerned that they're within 20 miles of an airstrike from Iran if things don't go right. They need to build relationships, and that's what they're doing. We also have to look at the history of Israel. Remember, in the early 80s, or I guess it was 1986, Saddam Hussein was building a nuclear reactor, and what happened? Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, went in there and took it out with an airstrike, a very preemptive airstrike that got the attention of the whole world and said, what's going on? Ronald Reagan at the time was surprised and a little upset that that happened, but it showed that they have a military presence and they're going to do everything they can to preserve peace in the Middle East. The Arab nations are more cooperative than they've ever been. We've seen the Palestinians not want to at all discuss a two-state solution. In fact, they don't want to discuss peace at all. It seems to me that, and that's contrary to, I think, what the Palestinian people really want. The Palestinian people do want peace. They want economic security. When you go to Israel and you go to the West Bank and you see the Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs working alongside each other, it's very heartwarming. But then you have the upper-level governments who are trying to keep it protracted for territorial purposes, and it's not healthy to the region. So, the Middle East will continue to be a powder keg, but I think it's starting to diffuse significantly from what has happened over the last 20 years there. And, with more and more technology being produced out of Israel, and that being beneficial to the other Arab nations, I think you see a stronger relation. I think you see a more peaceful and a better Middle East over the next 10 to 15 years, with the threat of Iran always lurking over them.
So what do you think, what is the most important challenge to U.S. security globally?
Probably our debt. When I went into Congress, we campaigned on debt and deficit. We campaigned on getting our spending under control. In 2011, I think we were, I want to say $12 trillion in debt, maybe, which was appalling at that time. Now we're $30 trillion just 10, 12 years later. It's appalling because we are the reserve currency, which means every other currency uses us as their baseline. We are what it is in the economic world. We're the ones that hold everything together. China's plan to be equal to the United States as a superpower in 2050 could happen. And if that happens in their regard, and they take over the reserve currency, it'll be devastating for the United States. Militarily, we are in a good position. I mean, we can't let our guard down. We have to continue to keep a strong defense, as walk softly and carry a big stick, as Teddy Roosevelt used to say. There's some merit there. Hopefully you never have to use your defensive tactics or your offensive tactics. But what's really important is that you develop economically ties with these other nations. And in order to do that, you've got to have a strong economy yourself, which means you need to have reduced debt and deficit. Let's take a look at this. Now, right now we pay close to $500 billion a year. The United States does in interest payments. Interest payments, not principal payments. $500 billion. We've got a 9.1% inflation, the highest we've had in 40 years. What happens to our debt? We have to service more debt, which means we have to take more money out of the United States budget instead of social programs, instead of for hunger, instead of for schools, instead of for infrastructure, instead of for military. We've got to use that to just pay interest. We can't sustain that type of system. And so we've got to get our debt and our deficit under control. I think that's one of the biggest security factors that we have facing our country today. The investment of foreign nationals into our country would only further exacerbate that as we continue to go deeper in debt. And we've got to get that under control.
What do you think is the benefit of the U.S. and the new Middle East? Like President Bush said a while ago, it should be the new Middle East.
It came about as a result of the Arab Spring and failed policies. And again, I don't want to get partisan here, but when Syria, when President Obama was in office and Syria attacked and they were using chemical warfare on their own people, and he drew a red line in the sand and did nothing against that. It kind of put us on our heels as not being an enforcer of what we say we're going to do, and to accept the fact that by default, we're the world's policemen. We're the security force. And if we don't do anything, then that's just going to force other bad actors to want to do more bad acts. And so we saw the Arab Spring start to deteriorate. There was Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and then what we also realized that when Mubarak was in office as the head of Egypt, one of the reasons there were such good relations between Egypt and Israel is because we invested in that peace. We put a lot of money there, and we backed off on that. I'm not so sure the new Middle East is where we want it to be. I'm not saying we go in and colonialize. Never should we ever do that. Never should we be nation builders. Never should we be there to do anything like that. We learned our lessons many times throughout our history, most recently in Iraq with ISIS. But what we did learn is that if we let them fight their own wars, if we help them build their own infrastructure, if we let them lead their own governments, and we are there on an advice side, that they become successful. Now, there may be greater lives lost, but that's what they learn themselves. When we learned from Iraq, after we did the surge and we left that void, ISIS developed, and it took over everything. And the reason that the Iraqis, the Kurds, didn't want to go back to their villages is because they were scared of ISIS, and we just left them holding empty space, a void. When we went in the second time, we let them do the fighting. We let them clear out their villages. We let them invite their people back into the towns, and they did. They came, they rebuilt their schools, they rebuilt their houses, they rebuilt their infrastructure, they rebuilt their businesses because they were doing it themselves. That is a lesson we need to be learning with the new Middle East. And I think that we've got good relations there. Things are working much better with definitely with Egypt. Jordan has been a great ally. Morocco's always there for us. We've got some issues in Libya, and I think that I'm not suggesting we go in there. I'm just suggesting that we help those who want to help themselves do a democratic form of government if they can so, conjure up the willpower to do that in some of these Arab nations.
How did the U.S. benefit from change in the Arab world after the Arab Spring?
We got rid of some bad actors, but they were controlled. But Mubarak was very oppressive to his people. That's true. Gaddafi was very oppressive to his people. The overthrowing of these created great disruption. I don't know if we've really benefited from the Arab Spring other than now having new leaders that we have to build diplomatic relationships with. And, we're watching the influx of immigrants coming from North Africa, going across at great peril to the Mediterranean, into Italy. We saw them come into Hungary several years ago, wanting to come to Europe because of Europe's immigration policies. And that is all a result of the Arab Spring and the destabilization of those Arab countries along North Africa and the Mediterranean. I haven't seen much benefit in that arena. I think America has to take a more diplomatic role, again, in trying to be a facilitator to these nations. We don't need to be a military might in their face, but we can show them that we have resources that can help them develop their economies and make a more interdependent relationship, not only with the U.S., but with other countries. That's where we are today. we're not a third world anymore. There are third world nations out there, but most people, because of technology, understand there's a better place out there, and that in order to get there, you've got to be given the opportunity, and they want to work for that. And if we show them the economic means by which that can be accomplished, I think we do much better off as an international community.
What is the biggest obstacle for the US and China to expand their relationship?
Well, it's tough to compete against China with our energy policy the way it is. And I'm not commenting on our energy policy other than to say that it's a totally different energy policy than China has. They have no energy policy. If it burns, they produce. It doesn't matter if it's coal, doesn't matter if it's gas, doesn't matter what it is, they're using that for production, which gives them a greater sense of or a lower cost of production, plus their labor is significantly lower. And they can compete against everybody. It's much more difficult for us. I'm not suggesting that we change our climate policies or our energy policies other than to say we have to be competitive if we want to have a level playing field with China. Now, China in the world market is good for competitive purposes because we need to be able to have competition in order to make better goods and services and to give the consumers the choice. Plus, we also need to have interdependent multilateral relationships, trade relationships with other nations. The unilateral ones that I think the Trump administration was after don't always serve the best purpose because there is, whether we like it or not, interdependent relationships that exist between all these nations. China is circumventing the United States, going into places like Cuba, going into South America, making major infrastructure investments, utilizing their resources, producing things at a lower cost because of their labor and their energy policies, and it's making it harder for us to compete. We need to be able to build relationships with other nations to be just as interdependent. These are trade relations that I'm talking about, so that we can, as a global community, compete against China and also to have competition amongst ourselves to create better products and resources. China's not going to go away anytime soon. They are committed to wanting to be a superpower, and they're making every effort to do that both economically and militarily throughout the globe.
What are your thoughts on China developing 6G?
That concerns me because that's information. That's the information highway. It's interesting because we watch it in the United States, and I'm digressing here, but we watch in the United States censorship happening by social media platforms. They're not governments. We used to always complain that government's going to censor you. Government doesn't have any control over censorship anymore because all the information platforms are in the private sector. Imagine the information platform now, everything going to 6G that is held almost exclusively by China. They will control all the information. They will control how it comes out, what comes out, where it comes out, and what you get to hear. It's not that I'm against the development of technology. No, I think technology is good, but it also is a two-edged sword. And if they're the only game in town developing 6G technology and we become dependent on that, it is a further instance in which the United States is going to be back down from where they need to be as a global protectorate, if you will, not only militarily, but also of the economy. I'm not against 6G, don't get me wrong. We haven't even developed 5G throughout this country yet, and yet here they are looking at 6G. But it concerns me for information purposes and the control of that information.
What should be the defense priority of the U.S. in 2022?
Serious look at the South China Sea. We've got to be able to make sure that we are there to protect our interests and our allies in the South Pacific. China is building military bases there. They're dredging up the ocean to build islands for that specific purpose. We've got Taiwan, who we have an agreement to protect. We're not prepared to protect them. I would hate to see a military strike of any type by China on Taiwan. I think they may have learned something from Russia's strike into Ukraine that may not be the best thing to do. Because the resilience of the Ukrainian people, I think the same resilience exists there for the Taiwanese. They would be the same way, but we've got to be there prepared to protect them. And I think as long as we have a force that is present, we can control the economic balance that I think is necessary in order to have a vibrant global economy. So our defense priorities should definitely be in the South Pacific. Now, China has already developed a base off the west coast of Africa, which gives them now control, not control, but at least access to the Atlantic Ocean. These are things that we defensively have to take into consideration and make sure that we're there to protect that. They're wanting to make infrastructure investments in Cuba, which is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. You know, we need to have a presence. I am not at all, and nor would I even suggest, I would be against any type of military involvement. But then again, the United States, because of its success, with all its warts, with all of its imperfections and all of its problems throughout its 240 some odd year history, is still the greatest superpower known to man, and is there by default or there by design, but it is there, and it needs to make sure that it stays there in order to protect those that also seek to have democracy and the fulfillment of their well-being.
How would you like to see the world to improve?
Well, you hit on something there, education. You know, we don't build, and now technology's shown us this over the last 15 years, we don't build relationships. We stay in our caves, if you will, for lack of a better expression, and hide behind our computer screens or our smart tablet or device, and we engage in opinions, whether there's any basis to them or not. And we've deteriorated the ability, which is one of the most fundamental needs of mankind, and that's to have social interaction in building relationships. We don't have to agree, just like my parents didn't agree politically when I was a kid, but they didn't get up all upset at each other over the political differences. We've got to be able to build relationships, and we need to be teaching this. We need to be teaching this at an early level, that it's okay to have a different view. It's okay to be a different person, but it's also okay to have the opportunity to have ground rules to discuss the controversial issue of the day. And that tomorrow, no matter what happens, there's going to be another issue. And you know what? We might not be on the same one today, but we might be on it tomorrow. So if you're my adversary today, I don't want to character assassinate you, because you may need to be my ally tomorrow, and I want to have that relationship. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be building ambassador relationships with other countries. We need to do more international programs where we bring students to the United States from other countries and vice versa, to show that we are not that much different, that we have the same desires to do better than the previous generation, that we want to build good families, we want to have strong economic bases, we want to have a peaceful life. You know, if we want to see the significant change, we got to change the culture. And the way the culture changes through building relationships, not only domestically amongst ourselves as in the United States, but more importantly internationally, with those in other countries, those especially of diverse thought, so that we can understand why they think the way they think. We don't have to agree with them. We just have to understand. And that helps build the relationships, and I think it leads us to a better world.
How do you feel about the latest decision of Roe versus Wade?
I am one of those people, having served in a state legislature and in Congress, that believes that the states do have a great deal of authority that has been delegated to them by way of the 14th Amendment, which means that I believe that states have significant rights, and that there are certain things that the federal government has significant rights that by far preempt anything the state initiatives would want to accomplish. And now you have to understand, from a policy perspective, I'm pro-life. I believe in a presumption of life over anything else. I believe that life begins at conception, so I am not at all disappointed with the Roe v. Wade. It does not outlaw abortions. It delegates to the states the method and manner by which, if they choose to, will regulate that procedure. And, you know, I think one of the things we've seen evolve from our country since its inception is a greater control by the federal governments to the exclusion of the rights of states. And you know, there are certain things where the federal government needs to be involved in, obviously militarily for strong defense, obviously for roads, infrastructure, education to some degree, but not to a great degree, because each geographic area is different, and learning in those areas becomes different. But more importantly, when it comes to these issues, a person's not only their own well-being, but especially the well-being of those who don't have representation, i.e. the unborn, then it should be delegated to the states. Because as they pointed out in the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there is no constitutional right to an abortion, and that is an element that has been delegated to the states by way of this recent decision.
What is your opinion about gun laws around the world and gun policies in the United States?
I'm a gun owner. I also have a concealed carry permit. I do hunt. I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. You know, I grew up in an era where kids actually did take their guns to school because they would go hunt with them after class. But if that's the case, then what has changed so much? Well, our culture's changed significantly, and the emphasis on mental health has become to the forefront, as it should, because we have ignored it for so long. Insurance policies, health insurance policies, ignored mental health because it wasn't a physical ailment, it was a mental ailment, and we only covered the physical aspect of it. And in the meantime, we developed greater emphasis on diagnosing mental health issues. We've seen a cultural change in the way we allow for video entertainments that are very violent, that people have a tendency to want to manifest their own violence through some of the similar actions they see in some of these video games and TV programs. The manifestation of this anger is done through violence, and violence is achieved through some mechanism, whether it be a gun, a knife, a car, a bomb, or a fist. And we need to address the source of that. What's causing that manifestation? I think Congress and states need to emphasize more on mental health. I think we need to be able to recognize that if a person has an issue, it's okay. We can bring you the help. We have support groups out there. You know, under the HIPAA Act in Florida, if I were a caregiver to somebody who had a mental health issue, especially one who had a propensity to commit violence, I could not go in and talk to the counselor or the treating physician and say, this is what I think, because there is a privacy there. So the counselor, the doctor, takes what they know only from the patient who says, I'm fine. When in fact, everybody else around them knows there's enough red flags, for lack of a better expression, to show that there's an issue there. We've got to focus more on mental health, and we need to make mental health treatments an acceptable form, as though you get the flu or break a leg or something of that nature. It is an ailment. It is a condition. We can address those. We can not only diagnose them, we can treat them successfully, and in most cases be able to absolve any further manifestations of violence, whether it be through a gun, whether it be through a knife, whether it be through a bomb, or whether it be through your fist. We've got to address that. We've seen, to this extent, Chicago, we've seen cities that have strong, significant, restrictive gun policies, and yet violent crime is greater there than it is in other places where they don't have the restrictive gun policies. There's got to be something else there. It can't just be the fact that that instrument of creating violence is the reason. Somebody has to be behind that, and there has to be something that forces them or manifests in them to do that violence using that instrument of violence.
Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with everything. And I'm looking forward to have you back on the show.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you.